Hello and welcome to Living One. My name is Deeksha and I will be stepping in for Olivia today. Firstly, I want to thank you all for allowing me to host today in place. I am so glad and honored to welcome all of you to our next Living One webinar. For those of you who don't know, Living One is Carolus' monthly webinar series, now in its 6th year, with guest speakers from all around the world. We listen in to how people are bringing their ethics, minds, and lives into alignment with nature for earth and animal liberation and revitalization. Our first series of 2025, Attending to the More Than Human World, explores the ethics of attention, why it matters when we unhook our minds and attention from human privilege and ground ourselves in the perspectives of animals, plants, rivers, seas, and forests. Over the next 2 months, 6 incisive thinkers offer thoughtful and practical guidance on how to pay deep and loving attention to animals, plants, and the earth. Join us for another year of rich conversations to learn how individually and in community we can take the necessary, concrete, timely steps towards a world of peace and wellness for all earth beings. Our guest today is Ralph Acampora. Ralph is the author of Corporal Compassion, Animal Ethics and Philosophy of Body, editor of Metamorphoses of the Zoo, Animal Encounter After Noah, and co-editor of A Nietzschean Bestiary, Becoming Animal Beyond Docile and Brutal. He has written many articles and chapters in the area of animal philosophy, teaches widely in applied ethics, and among other areas, has served as an animal advocate and worked as a park ranger before entering the academic profession. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various indigenous lands. I'm currently on the ancestral homelands of the Wangang. The Carrillo Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, takelma, Dakibetidae, coyote, goho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we welcome Ralph and Izzy.
Thank you so much, Deeksha. Beautifully stepping in there for Olivia. And Ralph, I'm so delighted to welcome you. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation to speak here. I know you occasionally attend Living One webinars, and I don't know quite how it was that I found your book, but it was this wonderful synchronicity because I found your book and I was reading it and really enjoying it. And then I was at a Living One talk and thought, that's the name. That's the same guy. And Corporal Compassion I found hugely inspiring, quite difficult for me in parts, but the sort of like premise, what you were saying there, just really spoke to me very powerfully. And consequently, although we've been looking at attention in one form, in the form of I'd said a lot of the time a sort of like visual or listening, the way that I think we're going to segue in the conversation with you is another form of attending that I think is, just as important and brings a whole new sort of perspective and dimension, perhaps, to our relationship with the more than human world. So I think you were going to start out by introducing your work and your thinking to us before we sort of go into a little bit more of a Q&A.
Yes, I wanted to share with you an entree into the subject matter. So this will be old school, no PowerPoint, sorry. There are at least 2 reasons to focus on parks, for instance. I have that in my background, and a park phenomenology is quite interesting and useful for elucidating the kind of attention I'm talking about. It's an interzone, a place in between urban and wild, and the park is the quintessential place of interspecific interaction. Hermeneuticist Joseph Grange observes that the human body is in such a place is flesh thought seeking the identity of the difference between city and nature. and thus to wonder about place through fleshly thought is to seek our home. In the midst of the urban parkland, we clear an open space that enables a residential dialectic between nature and culture. It is precisely in between these principles that we need to situate our articulation of what I'm calling a somatic home. The urban park is the cityscape's prime setting for cross-species conviviality, including interactions with a wide variety of non-human animals. As biocultural environments, parks present a promising and especially ecotonal locale for transpacific phenomenology. Grange offers a useful phenomenology relating to the park's body home. He says, a person sits in a park. He sees and feels the contrast between city and nature. In experiencing this contrast, he does not so much understand the differences as sense in a relaxed, dim way the fundamental unity of all reality. It is not a question of causal explanation, or for that matter, rational effort. His body recognizes the organic rhythms of nature and at the same time the powerful thrust towards order and symmetry which characterizes human building. These dimensions of human experience are different. The natural is not the urban, but the two connect because the body is able to inhere in both regions of value. What unifies these experiences is the active presence of the body. By being there in a fleshly way, the human body is one in the presence of a soaring skyscraper glimpsed through the leafy vista of summer foliage. This unification of experience is achieved through the somatic act of being in place. That's what I'd like to underline. That is why, he continues, city and nature are not opposed entities warring for our allegiance. The human body is, in its generosity, can experience both contexts as real and laden with value. So this snippet draws to our attention at least two significant aspects of park experience. First, ecotonally, as a sort of interzone, it illuminates the way in which the park is an urban natural site of paradoxically citified wilderness, wherein the city and the wild interpenetrate, qualifying but not annihilating each other. Second, somatically, it suggests that what permits such interpenetration is the carnal character of bodily being in a park. Building on these insights, I want to specify their scope to deal with human and animal conviviality. By being there in a fleshly way, the human body is one in the presence of a soaring skyscraper glimpsed through the leafy vista of summer foliage. So writes Grange of park experiences embodied seasonal sense of built and arboreal environment. Sensitivity to the cycle or dialectic of converting seasons tunes us into the phenomena of weather basic to climaticity, which is this Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro's complement to Heidegger's notion of historicity. There is a park in New York City's outer borough of Queens, in and from which one can experience just the scenario described above. Casino Park, it's called, and in the summertime, it affords a greenly tree-framed vision of Manhattan skyscraping towers on the horizon, maybe 10 miles off. Late in the season of heat and humidity, this sight, to further flesh out the scene, is accompanied by the sound of cicadas drumming their abdomens. The insectophonic concert begins with maybe only one or two individuals rattling their bellies in the rising temperature of mid-morning. Through the sweaty hours of afternoon, the day drips hot moisture that throbs acoustically with the pulsing crescendo and decrescendo of cicada chorus grown now to collectively huge proportions. You do not merely notice or register this biopercussive phenomenon, as by some attenuated audition. You feel it fully and resonate with its intensity. In such a context, what we can call hermeneutic hearing becomes phenomenologically pregnant. If we listen well to ourselves, we can hear within our embodiment resonances and echoes that confirm the interconnectedness of all beings and already bring us into communication with other mortals, gathering us together for the making of a more thoughtful history. As I resume the park phenomenology, I will try to maintain this sense, or at least a sense, of somatic thoughtfulness. In my thematized scenario, notice a life story is given testimony in certain manifest signs of emergence and metamorphosis. At its base are little cylindrical holes in the ground around the tree trunk. On its bark, there cling small, empty shells, skeletally shaped in a bug form, cracked open along the back line. Digging deeper scientifically, one discovers that the circadian cycle of life is here in evidence. The tiny animals begin living below the parkland surface, larvally burrowed into the earthy deep depths of some tree's root system. Literally radical sapsuckers, they remain submerged for years, 13 or even 17. When the time is right, the bloated bugs belly up into the air world above ground. There they slowly climb their arboreal hosts, wriggle out of their dirty skins, dry their winged bodies in summer heat, and finally fly off to crowd the branches of available street trees and forests. Then cicadas of the city sing. If one is lucky enough, she will spot an individual splitting and shedding its old crusty flesh, or another one drumming its tummy under a leaf. And if she cares to, she might look and listen long enough to learn to the insect's chthonic chronicle, which is sensorially present before her eyes and becomes reconstituted within earshot's temporal range. Now, as the summer comes to close, so too do the lives of the sonic insects. Not only its trees, but also the park's bushes and shrubs begin becoming empty choirs, where late cicadas sang, as one might be tempted to think. Yet the passage of seasons does not strip a parkland of its corporally channeled encounters between the species. In Casino Park, for instance, autumn is signaled in the sky by the honking flight pattern of Canadian geese. The geese alight upon the park's pond, become avian observers of the observing human traffic that rings the water. When winter comes, they will have gone, leaving the watery scene before it freezes over. Then, when it has hardened, the skaters and squirrels will share ice time. Eventually, a thickly fecund aroma of false decomposition will yield atmospherically to a crisp, wintry clarity of sight and smell. Warmer weather at last returns in the springtime, of course, and this warmth, though similar in objective temperature to the cool of fall, is palpably different in terms of lived climaticity. Spring is alive with a felt sense of thaw and reinvigoration absent in autumn. In this season, the park's faunal and floral environment alternates in tempo and tone between lively action and pleasant calm, and it is also filled with the promise of another summer. Thus do this parkscape's phenomenal seasons turn. Now, what I want to say is that the phenomena of climate and culture, nature and history are existentially interpenetrating and form the background and context of interspecific conviviality. Against this backdrop, experiences of transpacific intersomaticity come into greater relief. Chiasmic illustrations like those of Merleau-Ponty include the sensately intertwined haptic hearing of cicadas by emparked people and vice versa, maybe, as well as the reversibly observatory encounter between humans and geese. On the level of what I would dub municipal ontology, with a nod to Heidegger, such interanimalic instances of metropolitan mitsein, or being with, phenomenally display the somatic and cross-species nature of flesh and blood being in a world. The example of the reversible gaze between human and goose may seem innocuously quotidian, lacking any special significance. What is at stake here? What is important about two different animals noticing each other? My point, stepping aside or outside pure description, is that between the geese and the humans there passes a perceptual process laden with pragmatic potency, an experience not reducible to the merely visual event, man sees bird, bird sees man. Perhaps a contrasting illustration will help clarify. Commenting on the zoo's milieu, John Berger observes that the visibility through the glass, the spaces between the bars, or the empty air above the moat are not what they seem. If they were, then everything would be changed. Thus, visibility, space, air have been reduced to tokens. All this is what zoo animals makes them marginal. The space which they inhabit is artificial, hence their tendency to bundle towards the edge of it. In some cages, the light is equally artificial. In all cases, the environment is illusory. One wonders just what real space is or could be following on this observation of Berger's. His hint is the suggestion that the circumstances would change if irreality did not mark or taint the observational media. The real space of encounter, as I would elaborate this clue, is live space. That is the living room which permits genuine confrontation, complete with all its modal possibilities of adversity, avoidance, and free association. Of course, the zoo annihilates or interrupts rather these possibilities. Yet all those potencies for activity of fight and flight, of becoming foe or friend, of leaving off or moving in, remain in place in the wild and even at the park, such as I have described it. This, then, is the existential import and philosophic upshot of watching animals watching you in the field. That perception across differences of species is there charged with pragmatic concern or regard. Attention becomes contention, and thus it is difficult to spectate simply, neutrally, reductively, because survival vision and social sight must be literally respectful of another living being, taking care through fear or love to deal with the other in a phenomenally physical dimension of vital exchange and intercourse. Let me stop there and see what questions you might have up your sleeve.
So thank you ever so much, Ralph. One thing I just wanted to make clear for the people who had enrolled in the course, they will have had something of a primer for this, 2 readings from Ralph. For those of you who aren't enrolled in the course, this may or may not be sort of somewhat new to you. So just to take a sort of, a very basic dive into things, can you give us a sense of, this is the sort of beginner's guide introduction.
Okay.
What do we intend by phenomenology? What's the difference between looking at the world as a phenomenologist and looking at the world in, as an ethical philosopher, for example?
Okay, so what phenomenology wants to do is contribute to the philosophic toolkit, a method and a practice of purifying our description of the world about us, of our concrete experiences. And there are a number of fairly involved methods for doing this that Husserl, one of the founders, characterizes as a reduction. But we need to get into that to appreciate the idea of not explaining or justifying the world or principles, but stepping back and trying to describe it simply and carefully, very carefully, not trying to read interpretations into your experience of things, but letting it happen as it does happen.
There's a kind of analogy there to a mindfulness, to that kind of, well, I suppose it's an attentive being with the world rather than always trying to interpret it and make it your own.
Yeah, no, it's supposed to be a temporary thing and lead for as a propedeutic for other things, including interpretations and explanations and whatnot. But doesn't want to let them seep in at the beginning. Wants to start off with a clarified vision.
And you've talked somaticity, which of course is in the title of your talk. And so we're thinking here about being with other bodies, other creatures with bodies. Why is that so important in your thinking?
Well, I'd have to say that it's because I'm concerned with moral psychology, the bounce between our experience and the principles we discover in ethics. And the philosophers who went before me, a whole generation or two of them, in animal ethics in particular, had a moral psychology that focused precisely on the mentality and the mind as such. I had come across, fortunately, the reading of Merleau-Ponty, French existential phenomenologist in the middle of the 20th century, who made me think maybe there's a contrast or foil that one could develop to the traditional focus on mind, and look more at the body. And maybe this would make for more commonality between humans and other animals, for instance, since one could say we certainly share that element, even if we have doubts about language, thought, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and I think that idea of the bodily vulnerability, you work through that very well in the book when you're talking about watching a squirrel in the park. Maybe you could just sort of like recount that, the that sort of section where you're watching the squirrel and being very aware of the body. You become aware of what you are, what you were obliged not to do, and that comes forth almost as a truth in the way that you are in an environment with a squirrel.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a typical example of species in a park situation. And they have an unfortunate reputation in many uh, urban areas as a kind of what we call it, a pest,
Yes.
or a ground, sort of like the terrestrial version of a pigeon or something, and thinking that they're dirty or whatnot. And we don't take them seriously as wild animals, but they are. And what I find interesting is that they enable the possibility of cross-species behavior. And that happened to me in the situation that you're talking about, or that you flagged. I should say that my experience also, I think, as a kid growing up, was shaped about other animals because I was an only child. And so I think companion animals, those I found in parks and woodland areas, were like surrogate siblings almost to me. I don't want to reduce them to that. And I have to be aware of that being something that I brought to the experience that was not already there on site. And so it takes a little bit of purifying of description along with phenomenology to get to what exactly is going on when you're confronted with such another being, a carnate being.
And you describe how sort of in looking at the squirrel, you can feel how bad it would be to harm that squirrel by.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and I think there is something akin to the Iris Murdoch idea of when you attend well, you see the truth, and value is inherent within the world. It seems that with this focus on shared embodiment, the same kind of value is there already in the world. You don't have to then put a value on it by saying these things matter because they are related to me or because they are close to me. It's just there.
And you can recognize sometimes in specimens that maybe have an injury or something of that sort. You pick up vulnerability and you're aware of your own vulnerability at the same time. The fact that there's a kind of finitude to human, indeed animal existence, that is susceptible to injury, illness, mortality eventually, this kind of thing.
So you mentioned as a child being an only child. I was too, and I very
Mhm.
much relate to that. To the companion animals and
Yeah.
wild animals being, my best friends or sort of family. But is that how you became so interested in attending to the more than human world? Does it root right back to your childhood?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. This sense of felt kinship that I was mentioning or flagging before. I think that's very much the case. And then it deepened as I matured and took on more positions in the work world, including park rangering and that kind of thing.
And is there the way that you now think? I mean, I'm not sure how much it probably has changed you. It sounds like it might be more a way of describing what you were already doing. But
Mm.
if we were to sort of like look at this practice of being in a place and and attending to the shared embodiment of the more than human beings around us, how do you think that can change the way that a person thinks, feels, and acts? Has it changed you?
Yeah, it's a kind of it's made me develop a more solicitous mien and more mindful, as you were mentioning before. Alongside that, I want to say bodyful,
Yes.
aware of the fullness and the plenitude of the flesh. That those couple of things really did hit home for me.
We're talking here in your talk, we're focusing specifically on parks, and I think that's really helpful, because some of the time with the way that we're talking about relationships with the more than human world, it can feel as if, well, I haven't got access to companion animals, I haven't got access to the wilderness, and parks are a little bit more more able to
Accessible.
be visited. Yeah, accessible, that's the word. But if say you can't get outside, or you are in a very, very urban setting, do you think that there's a way that people can feel into this kind of sort of corporal conviviality, without necessarily being present in an environment where other animals and plants are?
Yeah, I think there really is. And I'll describe something. Taking a cue from a philosopher by the name of Martin Buber, I took a look at the confrontation that you can have with a tree or a plant or a bush or a shrub. And he's got a very nice meditation on this. He characterizes it as changing it into an I-thou relationship, rather than reducing the plant or tree to an object, an inert object, as in it, or something of that sort. And what I do is when I teach environmental philosophy and ethics, I take out the class to outdoors from the building we're in. And fortunately, my university has an arboretum on campus. And so we make our way over to the arboretum, and I set each of them up with a different piece of vegetation. And so there might be a dozen people. This is looks kind of funny to passersby or whatnot. They're all hanging out, having this silent intercourse with a tree or shrub or a bush or another kind of plant. And then we come back together and we talk about, what's your experience of this? Was it I, it? Was it I, thou? Did you have a sense that things were happening the way it did for Buber, or were you not able to get into the frame of mind for it? Or was it something that had to do with your bodily resonance with this other creature?
Wonderful. And those of you who are enrolled on the course, I will be sending out that exercise, which is the one that that Ralph recommended for you. There's something I've been wondering for a while. I read a passage in a book by the philosopher David Wood, and he asked, what are we, for example, to make of the silence of exterminated species? And so I've been thinking about attending to those who are not there, to the absent, the extinct, the pushed aside, and I wonder, can you, if you're thinking sort of phenomenologically, could you experience perhaps absence? Could you experience the bodies that aren't there?
I think you can. And I want to back up for 1 second and draw our attention to the phenomenon of when a person has a limb amputated. There's often a sensation that they report of a so-called phantom limb. They feel as if it's still there, even though the objective part is gone. Psychologically, it's still resonating in their body schema. Now, I want to draw an analogy between that and, on the other hand, the environmental scenario, where we're occupying what Merleau-Ponty would sometimes call the flesh of the world. A missing organism or species, I want to suggest, can be experienced by us not unlike the way the amputee is aware of their phantom limb. It's there but not there. It's there in a negative sense, and I think it's felt as a result of that too. Interesting work is being done lately on sort of the psychotherapy of environmental consciousness with regard to climate change, for instance. I'm sure we could do something like that in this arena too, with the missing organism or species that we come across.
What do you mean by that? Sorry, that's just really sort of piqued my interest. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
oh,
So just imagine that. Um, uh, I guess there's a lot of imagination has to come for this. If we're not ourselves amputees, we first have to do the try to imagine what it's like to see part of your limb not there, and yet to feel mentally as if it is still there. We're coming across there the difference between what is called corporeal reality, or the objective body, and corporal reality, which has to do with the living or live body. And there are all kinds of quotidian examples of this, not just the amputation phantom limb one, but if you're driving and parking a car, you have to feel as if your body is extended out to the periphery of the automobile if you're going to be parallel parking with any dexterity or facility. And so this sense of live body, these amputees do have with phantom limbs. And I'm just maybe we could also hypothetically at least wonder about try to feel ourselves into a kind of phantom species or phantom organism when we're coming across absence in the field.
I think that's actually really quite a beautiful idea for a different sort of ritual. Ava Meyer was talking about what how she believes that it's important to develop new sort of social and political rituals in these times, and I'm thinking that seems to me to be a rather wonderful one. Now, I don't know if you wanted to, if you had more that you wanted to say now, or whether I should go on with some more questions to you before we open up to the audience.
I did have more they could share, and then we can come back to more discussions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so here I focus in on vulnerability, the finitude of animate form. In the abstract, or for the animal as such, it is difficult to map an ethos with any phenomenological clarity. In order to gain climatic and cultural context, therefore, I return to the sort of parkland scenario portrayed before. Perhaps the quintessential inhabitants therein are the squirrels. And here we come to precisely to your example, to whom I trust most park visitors are accustomed. What kind of bodily encounters are possible with these rodents? None, the stay-at-home or pet-keeping skeptic might retort. Certainly, we do not ordinarily cuddle or tussle with them. Against such an objection, I hold that at least some of us sometimes have literal contact with squirrels. There are occasions, however infrequent, on which the rodents nibble foodstuffs from human hands. Moreover, tactile intimacy is not necessary to establish the symphysical unity I believe undergirds moral intuitions regarding the welfare of squirrels. Symphosis, as I call it, or somatic sympathy, is sufficiently manifested in the somaesthetic conviviality conducted through the medium of world flesh, or flesh of the world. Instances of intersomaticity that partially constitute this conviviality include that I first note the passage of seasons in the bushiness of squirrels' tails, orally attend to their clucking barks as they play or mate, watch them forage for food as I also gather edibles, and so on. How would such experiences lead to an appreciation of squirreldom? Well, much would depend on the tropological filters in use. If I live towards rodents in general as deviant similars, then they will not be for me truly fellow mammals, but rather perverse pests. However, if I live toward them as related others, then I come to positively value aspects of their being. For example, taking up the associated aesthetic of marvel, I become appreciative of tail bearing. I admire the myriad observable operations of tailing squirrel style, screening against wind, shading against sun, balancing on branches, cushioning for falls, guarding offspring, fun waving, and sex splashing, and so on. Finally, alongside or through such appreciation, I am inclined to feel, in a stewardly manner, obliged to protect squirrels. Positively, I experience a moral demand to look after their welfare. Negatively, I find it fitting that they go unharmed, subject to the ecosystemic dynamics of the park's biome. And here I would just footnote, there's some useful work done by a thinker by the name of Gail Weiss, who about 20, 25 years ago tried to unpack something she called bodily imperatives, thinking that the traditional philosophic ones were too bloodless. This is a concrete species expanded object lesson of body ethical argument recently put forth by Edith Visegrad in somewhat more abstract and decidedly more anthropocentric terms, to the effect that pain and death break into the descriptive and constitutive character of the body as text to introduce proscriptive and prescriptive meaning. Vulnerability, she observes, constitutes a proscriptive corporeal plea against violence, as if the other's body were saying, "Do not injure me." Likewise, according to Visegrad, it is incapable, or it is rather is capable, of engendering a prescriptive impetus towards ameliorative action, which may even result, with repetition, in a pattern of radically generous altruism. It may be objected that the illustration given before is too subjective. To this, I will reply that the first person voice is deployed above somewhat abstractly. For example, not so much or only to report my own experience, but rather also to invite others to place themselves in that same first-person position. In this twofold maneuver, I am following Hans Reiner's phenomenological method for doing ethics, according to which an indispensable avenue in the beginning is the phenomenologist's own moral consciousness. The methodology is filled out, as right now, by publication and audience comparison. So the listener is invited to conduct an existential, not merely thought experiment, and compare her own experience. What is called for is not armchair reflection. Instead, one would have to get acquainted with squirrels after the fashion described to actually feel what it is like. What are the pragmatic effects of this sensorial type of ethical experience? The obligation existentially developed above would tend, for example, toward disapproval of wanton tail chopping and pesticidal poison laying. The imaginative model of empathic identity deals with ethically troubling scenarios such as these by first assuming an experiential axis of subject-object bifurcation and then allowing a psychic bridge to be built by the subject's cogitative transference of the object's imagined distress. In practice, this would typically mean visualizing self as other, say a squirrel, then pretending to know the other's suffering, for instance, the tail wound's pain. Whereupon, by explicit or implicit appeal to moral sentiment, there arises the demand to alleviate present displeasure, as well as an obligation to prevent identical or similar stress in the future. Now, that model is not terribly great. It doesn't do for me all the work I want out of the ethical meditation here. So I move on and say that the identification model just furnishes off the mark, first because it falsifies the phenomenological experience at hand. When I wince at a squirrel with tail freshly cut and bleeding, I do not imaginatively identify with the animal by a series of mental machinations. What Lawrence Hattab has said about interpersonal empathy applies also here, mutatis mutandis. He says, empathic concern shows moments when we are directly and spontaneously affectively in there with the person, without a sense of conjuring up feelings or beliefs inside and then transferring them to the other person, or processing perceptual data as misfortune and then triggering an affect and then recasting it out to the other. All of this is an inferential procedure of external reception, internal processing, and projective transmission. No, the shared affect simply happens. Beyond such testimony of phenomenological fact, I suspect that the very notion of psychic identification being questioned is muddled. If I were that or a squirrel, what can a conditional of this sort mean? Consider, if I were really a squirrel, then I would not be the human ego I know as me. I would no longer be my true self. And so it seems that real identity cannot be putatively transferred. A defender of such transference may wish to object that the process does not cancel, but rather sublimates anthropic subjectivity into the zoomorphic persona. But then what imagination yields is either a humanoid squirrel or a squirrely human. In any case, not a squirrel simpliciter. Though conceptually anthropocentric, my position is not ideologically anthropocentrist, rather. Quite generally, I hold that whereas we can and do intelligibly try to understand other circumstances from their points of view, we should give up the pretense that we are capable, under ordinary conditions, of colonizing anyone else's consciousness. Another reason why the empathic identification model goes awry is because it enforces a misplaced theoretical construct, the subject-object dichotomy, upon the scenario in order to deliver the standard ethical paradigm of moral agent, human observer, and moral patient, squirrel victim. However, lived morality is not always, and seldom exactly, patterned in accord with this paradigm. In the examples under consideration, for instance, my ethical experience is that the symphysical life world shared with squirrels is so aesthetically lacerated when a tail belonging to one of them is cut by gratuitous violence. Likewise, the park Liebeswelt, or world home or body home, between, through, and around us, has its existential fabric ripped when a normally nimble squirrel twitchingly tailspins into toxic seizure on account of poisoning. In such experiences, there emerges at once a moral awareness of ecosystemic fragility beside an ethical sensitivity to organismic vulnerability. These sensibilities have deontic or duty-based import. They motivate protectionist actions being taken and principles being formed on behalf, micrologically, of members of other species, and macrologically on behalf of eco-gestaltic forms such as park or woodland. By way of comparison, contemporary hermeneut John Caputo similarly assesses physical unfoldings of conscience and consciousness. He, too, concludes that they do not occur in the space of egology. He asserts that this sort of transaction is not an operation that the eye performs. It is not what Husserl calls an ego act, by the magic of empirical empathy or transcendental transfer, which are redundant attempts to cross through a ground on which we already stand. This previously occupied terrain is what I call symphosis or somatic empathy. Caputo stresses that this site of obligation's body is constructed entirely as an operation of flesh. It is, excuse me, able to reflect on this, or advisable to reflect on this form of paleonymous phrasing, for which I too sometimes opt, since the old terms of carnality bear histories of usage that risk obscuring the matter. Flesh becomes cutaneous corporeality in ordinary parlance and marks the matrix of oculocentric perceptibility for at least Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. Yet what I'm most inclined to call somatic sympathy is only incompletely described as a dermal deed or as an affair of visibility and invisibility. Experientially, it is as well a whole body phenomenon, also felt subcutaneously in the bones, registering viscerally in the gut, taking place throughout the thickness of live bodyment's material dimension or aspect. My quasi-poetic formulation is patent and perhaps requires some explanation. The field phenomena I seek to describe are so panoramic in scope that their thematic articulation elicits the wide-eyed, even peripheral vision, especially available through metaphoric discourse. More than this, the life states are non-positional forms of awareness, and thus they are particularly ill-suited to discursive investigation via strictly conceptual propositional analysis. Additionally, my account treats both the holistic dimension and the realm of the individual at once, rather than bifurcating them and then taking sides for one over the other. This feature is helpful for healing schisms in transhuman moral theory between holist and individualist approaches to environmental and animal ethics. In addition, my claims are earthbound and culturally contextualized. I believe they speak to fairly common, potential if not actual experiences of real people whose lives are embedded in the contingencies of natural and social history. Dropping transcendental and transcendental pretenses of philosophy, I'm neither trying to lay an apodictic foundation nor trading in metaphysical truths or eternal essences, a la Plato and company. Yet, as per Reiner's defense of hermeneutic ethics, I admit that absolute certainty is of course beyond reach here, but it is safe to say that a high degree of probability is not unattainable in favorable circumstances. In other words, refusal of absolutivity does not necessarily vitiate moral validity. What normative bite there may be in my moral phenomenology would derive from its intersubjectival resonance, and not, for counterexample, its putative participation in heavenly forms or goodness as such or things of that nature that philosophers traditionally have appealed to. Finally, the cross-species awareness of vulnerability I have sought to articulate does not rely on mentation conceived as inherently private consciousness. Indeed, the intersubjectively ethical dimension of transpacific somaticity is precisely attributable to its symphysical nature. And hence, in this way, my phenomenology departs from traditional appeals of moral etiology or sentiment theory. Cultivating embodiment theory of interanimality is not a matter of mentally working one's way into other selves or worlds by quasi-telepathic imagination, but is rather about becoming sensitive to an already constituted interzone of somaesthetic conviviality. And maybe we could take up more.
Yes, thank you. It's so rich, and I feel that people will be have a lot to think about. There are a couple of questions already in the chat, and I'd like to invite Aaron to ask your question. I think yours is the one of the first ones up there. So if you feel happy to unmute yourself, Aaron, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this conversation. I've done some work with imagination exercises related to nature, and so I was wondering, in regard to what we're discussing, are these similar to the types of nature meditations that Goethe describes?
Yes,
And
very much so.
And you also mentioned kind of almost like more of a servant role. So it seems like, are these more of a nature type meditation where you're embodying a servant role with the animals and the plants, like being a ranger or a landscaper, or almost it even sounded like a grief bearer of like
Yeah,
extinct species to hold the space, as that timeline is almost grieving.
that's a nice way of articulating in terms of the server role. I had not encountered that before, and I should work it into my thought. Thank you.
Katerina, you've contributed a few things there to the chat. I don't know if you wanted to sort of round up your comments, and thank you.
Yeah, I can try to do that. Lots of stuff moves in my brain right now. I'm thinking about, you talk about different things, how embodiment and what I call emplacement is correlated, and how when we share space with another species,
Yes.
you wrote about how weather, the climate, there's stuff that we can share through our body, our animality, our way of being in the flesh, as you say.
Yes.
That kind of impacts us all, whether we are a squirrel or human.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't really have a question. I'm more curious about like if we're not to use our imagination, because that's another way, as you spoke about, to get closer. Have you more suggestions about this experiencing embodiment together with another squirrel, horse, elk, whatever?
Yes.
How do you get into that space inside of yourself?
Yeah.
If
I
that makes
think
sense.
I think it's not so much about getting, but attuning to a point where you realize you're already there.
Yeah.
And I don't want to demonize imagination. It has a significant role to play. I just think it's not primordial. It comes later on, intermediate or towards the end of your discipline or practice and this kind of thing.
Because also
But
in our human development, we start there as kids
yes,
with this very, sensory way of experiencing the.
yes. It reminds me of what some thinkers have said, is that the philosophy of deep ecology in particular is sort of the worldview of any well-raised 5-year-old. um, and that the deep ecologist is just trying to not jettison or get rid of that child time and bring it back into their adult persona somehow, and recapture just the feeling of resonance with other creatures, and taking the experience of value outside of yourself, and this kind of thing.
A little bit like letting your inner child
Yeah,
lead, maybe.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Anne, you have your hand up, and then Fanula.
So this is resonating really deeply. And first, I again want to thank you for putting this whole series on. But I think this is helping me to understand the whole idea of where most of us who come to this can point back to something in our childhood. And I wanted to share very briefly. I'm going to try very briefly my connection. I was raised in a typical middle class white family in the US, and with the trauma that is associated with that, which is much less than many and more than others. So, but I was actually raised, I was introduced, we moved when I was 7, and I was introduced to a 1-year-old German Shepherd named Jill and a 9-year-old thoroughbred horse named Flint. They belonged to our next door neighbors who had 7 acres. We had 3. We fell in love, Jill and I, and Flint and I, the day we met. I spent most of my time with them. The people who owned them owned a business. Their children were older and they were gone most of the time. So I was over there every day, and I was not allowed to be, of course. And finally, they hired me when I was 9 to bring the horses in to feed them their dinner. There were 3, 2 Appaloosas and 1 thoroughbred, and to feed them and to muck their stalls and brush them so that I would have a task to do.
Yeah.
I have known for decades that my relationship with them saved me from a lot of the trauma that my siblings experienced with our alcoholic father, and because I had this relationship with them. I've only come to realize very recently that Jill and Flint were the adults in our relationship, that they raised me, and that because when I was with them, when I was 7, Flint stood 16'2". He's a huge horse. He had been kicked out of the Detroit police force because they said he was immature and untrainable. The truth is, he was a joyful Buddha, certainly a bodhisattva, if not a Buddha. He just loved. And so he and we played constantly. And I had the trust of this being that was hugely bigger than me, and could have hurt me, could have killed me, right? But of course, never, ever, ever did. And we played, and now when I look back on that, he raised me. He raised me. Yet, whenever I have tried to share that story, people blow me off. They laugh. They that I had deep relationship. This is all so good to be able to share.
Yeah. And Buber says at one point, we should he says something like, let no one disparage or reduce or undervalue relation. Relation is mutual.
Yeah. So,
Beautiful.
yeah. Thank you.
And Fionnuala, I think you were talking about playfulness and coming back to Katerina's idea of the divine child, I think.
Yes, yes, very much. Yeah, very much relating to what everyone said actually, and it really made me think. Today was just a beautiful, warm, sunlit day. It felt like spring was coming. I'm in London, and something that I've seen my dog do a few times, and she did today. She likes chasing squirrels. She's a dog, they're squirrels. And I noticed a squirrel see her coming, see the two of us coming, and notice. And the squirrel caught my eye, interestingly. And then my little dog ran towards the squirrel. And actually, this time, the squirrel tripped as the squirrel was running away. And I thought, oh my God, she's good. And actually, Chica, my little dog, she ran around the squirrel. She wanted to she had to kind of do a jackknife turn to not hit the squirrel who tripped over, and then ran up a tree. And it was just, I suppose, what something that this felt like. It felt a playful day, in partly that it felt a young day. And I think thinking about how, as children of whatever species, we play, we learn through play. And that there was danger in that play too.
Yeah.
But it was really just a really vivid experience of not of sharing an environment and sharing an experience that was different for each of us. I think in that triad, and the wood itself, and the birds, and but it just no, I was really, everything, Ralph, you've been talking about, and other people's questions in the chat has kind of enriched that experience for me. So thank you.
Yeah, the play is unfortunately belittled by so many people and authorities, but it's given great attention by a few sages in our tradition in modern Western history. And the one I'm thinking of is Johann Huizinga, who writes a whole book on Homo ludens, that the playful animal. He wants to say that that's what we are.
Now I have to ask Carlo, do you want to ask a question? I met Carlo at the University of Vienna in September last year, so it was really exciting. You and Ralph know each other, so you've turned up here, and it's lovely to see you again. So I don't know if you have anything you would like to bring to the table.
Thank you, Izzy. Maybe I'm too academic because I have an academic question, and maybe it's not the right I don't know, class for a too academic question. But if you want, I can go ahead with this. So, but my question is about the sympathy, that the term that you use.
Yes.
And then you also talked about empathy today.
Yes.
But I remember in your book that you're quite critical of. So your book is also an academic book. So
Yes.
you go into the specific of animal ethics or ethics in general. So
Yes.
compassion is a different tradition and a value than empathy or sympathy today.
Yeah.
It's more the traditional ethical moral sentiment, whereas today empathy is more popularized. So did you change your mind a bit about sympathy and empathy, or?
This is great because I've just been reading more of your chapters in your text to come out shortly. And particularly the sessions on empathy and so forth. Okay, so here's the way I see it. Compassion and sympathy are, for me, synonymous terms. They're both different, however, from empathy. And I follow the etymology here. I'm thinking of empathy as a projective maneuver, inserting yourself into another's frame of reference. And I think that is not a primordial experience, that I believe sympathy is and compassion is. It's a feeling with or alongside another. And I suppose I can plead guilty to being limited by the etymology here. If you have better notions or definitions, I'll certainly ferret them out from your text and what you have to say now.
I don't have better definitions, but I saw that you were engaging with empathy, which I think you in what you said today, with I mean, even empathy as a positive. You said is not primordial, but then it
Yes.
has a positive. It could have, in certain circumstances, a positive balance, right? That's
Yeah.
what.
Potentially later, not foundationally. For me, sympathy is foundational, and empathy. Empathy for me is also loaded with the attempt or the pretense of pretending that you can assume someone else's perspective entirely, that you can, as I put it in the book, colonize another consciousness. I don't think that's really possible. But you can feel along with somebody else, and they likewise with you. And that's what's happening with sympathy, I think. Some people say compassion is not entirely synonymous because it also brings along with you the notion of doing something on behalf of that you're having compassion for or with. And then finally, others say it's condescending, and I think that's mistaken. That the condescending form of relationship is rather pity, which is not for me synonymous with compassion.
It's interesting, the etymology, and Aaron's brought up a rather wonderful, because thinking about sympathetic magic in an older English use of the term. So sympathetic magic would be it's an occult light, almost magical influencing of one mind or body by another. So sympathetic magic would be, that dandelion in French is called pissenlit, pea in the bed, and so the idea is that that's a sort of sympathetic magic. You eat something that's called wee in your bed, and you wee in the bed. So there's a kind of sympathetic magic going on there. So that's, I mean, etymology is just I can go down a lot of rabbit holes, but Aaron continues that so this idea of the almost magical influencing of one mind or body by another, especially in physiology and pathology, and in the Himalayas, the tribal people train their golden eagles to know them by spitting on the eagle's food, the sharing of pathology triggering occult sympathy between incarnate beings. That is just rather, Aaron, thank you for that. That's a yeah, I think I probably do share quite a lot of pathologies with my cats. I don't spit on their food, but I think they possibly sneeze on mine quite regularly.
People who are interested in this.
Sorry?
I just want to say that people who are interested in this kind of connection might want to look at the books of David Abram. Becoming Animal is one, and The Spell of the Sensuous is another. He's a magician and philosopher both.
Both wonderful books. Really, I loved both of them. And on the conversation that you two were having about sympathy and empathy, I think part of my presentation in Vienna was about an idea of empathy that came from Dan Zahavi's work, where so he's suggesting the idea that by that there can be an immediate access to the contents of the other's mind, while also having an awareness that it is their mind. So you're not projecting yourself inside, you're allowing in the experience of the other while acknowledging that it is the other. And I think that that idea of empathy, when it comes to animal ethics, when it comes to sort of compassion within a human environment, that is to me personally possibly the sort of strongest and most sort of like effective in terms of motivating my own action. But I'm chattering too long. Does anyone else have a question? Have I missed anything there in the chat while I've been thinking thoughts? There's another new message. Mary?
There we go.
There you
Yeah, I just have a squirrel story, and this seems like a good time to interject it, but I have little squirrels that visit, and there was one morning the squirrel was out, and it was a different squirrel. I don't know every one of them. They don't all have this hugely distinguishing marks, but this one came by, and his left chest had been abraded. It was red. Just and I was taken aback. I didn't know. And it's not like I didn't at the moment think about, well, what should I do or anything like that. I was just really taken aback by the fact that he had this abraded chest, and I felt it must be painful. And it wasn't until later that I thought, oh, gee, why didn't I do something? But of course, I mean, what can I do? He's a wild squirrel. I don't have, but there was this connection somehow, and I don't know how that fits in with, what pathy it is, but it was just, and I tell you, it almost haunts me because I feel like I don't know what would have ripped his skin off in one area, or it just. Seeing something like that, I guess, in another person, animal, whatever, you just there's this feeling that this is painful.
Yeah.
But there's nothing like I can do. Like in some instances, I'm a caregiver kind of person. I could do something, but this was just a recognition of pain. Does that make maybe?
Yeah. No, I think that sounds authentic and exactly the sort of thing I was trying to get at.
Yeah, it was an experience for sure.
And these are the things that are I know Trudy, who can't attend live, but she's one of the people enrolled in the course who's been going through the recordings and the exercises and the readings, and one of the things that she has been asking about is that these, you pay attention, or you place yourself in this sort of shared environment, and a lot of what you can experience can be painful, can be the fear and the injustice, and often pain. And what are we to do with those feelings when there isn't anything that very much that you can do? And so Ralph, I think we have an audience here of people who are sort of really open to the idea that it's bad to cut a squirrel's tail. I'm not going to do it. But what do we do when we see? I mean, that squirrel might have had mange or something. Do we go around dosing everyone with ivermectin? Is it live and let? It's just, there is this world of painful things when we open our eyes to it. What do we do?
And the biggest one for me is what I call the problem of predation. What are we supposed to make of that phenomenon, that we're heterotrophs and feed off of other life? How does that fit into an animal ethic or an environmental morality? What are we supposed to make of that arrangement? It's difficult to imagine, if you're a religious believer, that you can mount a theodicy of predation. And even in a secular situation, you could often feel, maybe, for instance, that why did it come about this way? Couldn't we have all been autotrophs instead of heterotrophs? And all I can say is that however we try to develop our thinking and feeling down this pathways, we have to, I think, hold on to what I would call the tragedy of predation. The prey really doesn't want to be eaten. And even though some folks delude themselves into thinking that that's the case, I think that because they're still trying to process the situation. And I would rather, in the words of Donna Haraway, stay with the trouble. This is a troubling experience. We come across bad and negative things in life and in nature, including big ones such as predator-prey relations. And we shouldn't paper them over or try to dismiss them or try to make them evaporate or something like that. We have to stick with the trouble.
Thank you, Ralph. And I just wanted to ask Patricia if you were happy to make your comment, or otherwise I'll read it for you, because I think it might be a lovely idea with which to end our session today. So I don't know if you want to appear or just unmute. I'll read it. So Patricia, now my space is gone. Patricia wrote, a lot of this seems to be about allowing space, having a deep reverence for the other, and being free to allow space for them. And I think that is, there is something something really wise in that idea of the deep reverence for the other, and in the idea, as you said, that it's not a deviant sameness, but similar other, that idea of there is this radical alterity there, despite all the similarity. This is another being with their own desires, and I want you to be. Patricia, you look as if you might be appearing. No. Well, maybe she will. Maybe she will. And also, I think there is the space for us to allow ourselves to share these thoughts, to express them, to deepen them in a community as well. And I think that's also valuable.
Yeah. One thing I would say in listening to you was one existential phenomenologist by the name of Martin Heidegger spent a lot of time unpacking the temporality of human being. But it's not just time that's important to our foundation and our sense of consciousness of the world. It's also space. And when space is taken seriously, then you branch out into not just history, but geography and climate understandings of our awareness and consciousness of the environment around us.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you so much, Ralph, for your time this evening for me, this morning for many of you, probably afternoon, lunchtime. Who knows? It could be any time, any space, anywhere. I'm sure that's a catchphrase from something. But anyway, thank you so much for your time, and I do hope that you've enjoyed it. And I will be sending out to those enrolled in the course the exercise that you suggested with the tree. So much appreciation for that as well.
Can I ask for a copy of the chat if it's possible?
Yes, I know it comes up in some kind of like peculiar text format on my computer. Diksha, you can, oh, thank you. Diksha will manage that. Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, you certainly will get a copy of the chat. Thank you very much. And I will hand you back over to Diksha, who is going to wrap everything up in a sort of professional and timely fashion. Thank you all for your for being here and for sharing this space. I really appreciate your lovely presence.
Thank you, Izzy. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, everybody, for such delightful conversation and beautiful questions. Please note, for our next Living One webinar next week. We will not be meeting at the regular space. Our course group will be gathering for our midpoint check-in during this time. If you'd still like to join us for that course and the gathering next week, it's not too late. You can visit our website, carulos.org, to reach out, or follow the link in the chat to enroll. Here, I will paste it right here. And we would look forward to anyone coming. Our next Living One speaker will be 2 weeks from today on March 14th at a slightly later time than usual. It will be on the 14th starting at 2 p.m. PT instead of our usual 10 a.m. Pacific time. We will be welcoming Sky Salita Fleur, who will be speaking to us about reawakening animate relationship, attention, feeling, and the dreaming mind. As always, if you enjoyed today and feel called to support Kurulos, Living One, and all our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link on our website, carulos.org. The process of attending is greatly heightened through meditation and mindfulness, so if you'd like to deepen your experience with attending, please join us in exploring a meditative practice at our weekly Vital Breath for Earth silent meditation, followed by reflective practice every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Once again, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Ralph, for sharing your time and wisdom. Thank you from all of us here at Kurulos. We really appreciate you for being here, especially me. I want to thank you all again so much for trusting me and allowing me to host for this session. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful day. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.